Chapter 5. The darkness had prologued the pain in the storm cloud. He began to remember what had prologued the darkness as she told him what had happened to him. This was shortly after he had asked the traditional when the sleeper wakes question, and she had told him he was in the little town of Sidewinder, Colorado. In addition, she told him that she had read each of his 8 novels at least twice, and had read her very favorites, the Misery novels, 4, 5, maybe 6 times. She only wished she would write them faster. She said she had hardly been able to believe that her patient was really that Paul Sheldon, even after checking ID in his wallet. "Where is my wallet, by the way?" he asked. "I've kept it safe for you," she said. Her smile suddenly collapsed into a narrow watchfulness he didn't like much. It was like discovering a deep crevasse almost obscured by summer flowers in the midst of a smiling jocund meadow. "Do you think I'd steal something out of it?" "No, of course not. It's just that the rest of my life is in it," he thought. "My life outside this room, outside the pain, outside the way time seems to stretch out like the long pink string of bubble gum a kid pulls out of his mouth when he's bored. Because that's how it is in the last hour or so before the pills come." "Just what, Mr. Man?" she persisted, and he saw with alarm that the narrow look was growing blacker and blacker. The crevasse was spreading, as if an earthquake was going on behind her brow. He could hear the steady, keen whine of the wind outside, and he had a sudden image of her picking him up and throwing him over her solid shoulder, where he would lie like a burlap sack slung over a stone wall, and taking him outside and heaving him into a snowdrift. He would freeze to death, but before he did, his legs would throb and scream. "It's just that my father always told me to keep my eye on my wallet," he said, astonished by how easily this lie came out. His father had made a career out of not noticing Paul, any more than he absolutely had to, and had, so far as Paul could remember, offered him only a single piece of advice in his entire life. On Paul's 14th birthday, his father had given him a Red Devil condom in a foil envelope. "Put that in your wallet," Roger Sheldon said, "and if you ever get excited while you're making out at the drive-in, take a second between excited enough to want to and too excited to care, and slip that on. Too many bastards in the world already, and I don't want to see you going in the army at 16. Now Paul went on. "I guess he told me to keep my eye on my wallet so many times that it stuck inside for good. If I offended you, I'm truly sorry." She relaxed, smiled. The crevasse closed. Summer flowers nodded cheerfully once again. He thought of pushing his hand through that smile and encountering nothing but flexible darkness. Flexible darkness. "No offense taken, it's in a safe place. Wait, I've got something for you." She left and returned with a steaming bowl of soup. There were vegetables floating in it. He was not able to eat much, but he ate more than he thought at first he could. She seemed pleased. It was while he ate the soup that she told him what had happened, and he remembered it all as she told him. And he supposed it was good to know how you happened to end up with your leg shattered, but the manner by which she was coming to this knowledge was disquieting. It was as if he was a character in a story or a play, a character whose history is not recounted like history, but created like fiction. She had gotten into Sidewinder in the 4-wheel drive to get feed for the livestock and a few groceries, also to check out the paperbacks at Wilson's Drug Center. That had been the Wednesday that was almost 2 weeks ago now, and the new paperbacks always came in on Tuesday. "I was actually thinking of you," she said, spooning soup into his mouth and then professionally wiping away a dribble from the corner with a napkin. "That's what makes it such a remarkable coincidence, don't you see? I was hoping Misery's Child would finally be out in paperback, but no such luck." A storm had been on the way, she said, but until noon that day, the weather forecasters had been confidently claiming it would veer south toward New Mexico and the Sangre de Cristos. "Yes," he said, remembering as he said it. "They said it would turn, that's why I went in the first place." He tried to shift his legs. The result was an awful bolt of pain, and he groaned. Don't do that, she said. If you get those legs of yours talking, Paul, they won't shut up. And I can't give you any more pills for 2 hours. I'm giving you too much as it is. Why aren't I in the hospital? This was clearly the question that wanted asking, but he wasn't sure it was a question either of them wanted asked. Not yet, anyway. When I got to the feed store, Tony Roberts told me I better step on it if I was going to get back here before the storm hit, and I said, "How far are we from this town?" he asked. "A ways," she said vaguely, looking off toward the window. There was a queer interval of silence, and Paul was frightened by what he saw on her face, because what he saw was nothing, the black nothing of a crevasse folded into an alpine meadow, a blackness where no flowers grew, into which the drop might be long. It was the face of a woman who has come momentarily untethered from all of the vital positions and landmarks of her life, a woman who has forgotten not only the memory she was in the process of recounting, but memory itself. He had once toured a mental asylum. This was years ago when he had been researching Misery, the first of the 4 books which had been his main source of income over the last 8 years. And he had seen this look, or more precisely, this unlook. The word which defined it was catatonia, but what frightened him had no such precise word. It was rather a vague comparison. In that moment he thought that her thoughts had become much as he had imagined her physical self, solid, fibrous, unchanneled, with no places of hiatus. Then slowly her face cleared. Thought seemed to flow back into it. Then he realized flowing was just a tiny bit wrong. She wasn't filling up like a pond or a tidal pool. She was warming up. Yes, she's warming up like some small electric gadget, a toaster, or maybe a heating pad. I said to Tony, "That storm is going south." She spoke slowly at first, almost groggily. But then her words began to catch up to normal cadence and to fill with normal conversational brightness. But now he was alerted. Everything she said was a little strange, a little offbeat. Listening to Annie was like listening to a song played in the wrong key. But he said it changed its mind. "Oh, poop," I said. "I'd better get on my horse and ride." "I'd stay in town if you can, Miss Wilkes," he said. "Now they're saying on the radio it's going to be a proper geezer and nobody's prepared." But of course I had to get back. There's no one to feed the animals but me. The nearest people are the Roydmans, and they are miles from here. Besides, the Roydmans don't like me. She cast an eye shrewdly on him as she said this last, and when he didn't reply, she tapped the spoon against the rim of the bowl in peremptory fashion. "Done?" "Yes, I'm full, thanks." "It was very good. Do you have a lot of livestock?" Because he was already thinking, if you do, that means you've got to have some help, a hired man at least. Help was the operant word. Already that seemed like the operant word, and he had seen she wore no wedding ring. "Not very much," she said. "Half a dozen laying hens, 2 cows, and Misery." He blinked. She laughed. "You won't think I'm very nice naming us so after the brave and beautiful woman you made up. But that's her name, and I meant no disrespect." After a moment's thought, she added, "She's very friendly." The woman wrinkled up her nose and for a moment became a sow, even down to the few bristly whiskers that grew on her chin. She made a pig sound, oink, 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 oink. Paul looked at her wide-eyed. She did not notice. She had gone away again, her gaze dim and musing. Her eyes held no reflection, but the lamp on the bed table twice reflected, dwelling faintly in each. At last she gave a faint start and said, "I got about 5 miles, and then the snow started. It came fast. Once it starts up here, it always does. I came creeping along with my lights on, and then I saw your car off the road, overturned." She looked at him disapprovingly. "You didn't have your lights on." "It took me by surprise," he said, remembering only at that moment how he had been taken by surprise. He had not yet remembered that he had also been quite drunk. "I stopped," she said. "If it had been on an upgrade, I might not have. Not very Christian, I know. But there were 3 inches on the road already, and even with the 4-wheel drive, you can't be sure of getting going once getting going again once you lose your forward motion. It's easier just to say to yourself, oh, they probably got out, caught a ride, etc., etc. But it was on top of the third big hill past Roidman's, and it's flat there for a while, so I pulled over, and as soon as I got out, I heard groaning. That was you, Paul. She gave him a strange maternal grin. For the first time, clearly, the thought surfaced in Paul Sheldon's mind. I am in trouble here. This woman is not right. 6. She sat beside him where he lay in what might have been a spare bedroom for the next 20 minutes or so and talked. As his body used the suit, the pain in his legs reawakened. He willed himself to concentrate on what she was saying, but was not entirely able to succeed. His mind had bifurcated. On one side, he was listening to her tell how she had dragged him from the wreckage of his '74 Camaro. That was the side where the pain throbbed and ached like a couple of old splintered pilings, beginning to wink and flash between the heaves of the withdrawing tide. On the other, he could see himself at the Boulderado Hotel, finishing his new novel, which did not, thank goodness for small favors, feature Misery Chastain. There were all sorts of reasons for him not to write about Misery, but one loomed above the rest, ironclad and unshakable. Misery, thank goodness for large favors, was finally dead. She had died 5 pages from the end of Misery's child. Not a dry eye in the house when that happened, including Paul's own. Only the dew falling from his ocularies had been the result of hysterical laughter. Finishing the new book, a contemporary novel about a car thief. He remembered typing the final sentence of Misery's child. So Ian and Geoffrey left the little Dunthorpe churchyard together, supporting themselves in their sorrow, determined to find their lives again. While writing this line, he had been giggling so madly it had been hard to strike the correct keys. He had to go back several times, thank goodness for the good old IBM correct tape. He had written the end below, and then had gone capering about the room, this same room in the Boulderado Hotel, and screaming, free at last, free at last. Great God Almighty, I'm free at last. The silly bitch finally bought the farm. The new novel was called Fast Cars, and he hadn't laughed when it was done. He just sat there in front of the typewriter for a moment, thinking, you may have just won next year's American Book Award, my friend. And then he had picked up a little bruise on your right temple, but that didn't look like anything. It was your legs. I could see right away, even with the light starting to fade, that your legs weren't. The telephone and called room service for a bottle of Dom Perignon. He remembered waiting for it to come, walking back and forth in the room where he had finished all of his books since 1974. He remembered tipping the waiter with the $50 bill and asking him if he had heard a weather forecast. He remembered the pleased, flustered, grinning waiter telling him that the storm currently heading their way, was supposed to slide off to the south toward New Mexico. He remembered the chill feel of the bottle, the discreet sound of the cork as he eased it free. He remembered the dry, acerbic, taste of the first glass, and opening his travel bag and looking at his plane ticket to New York. He remembered suddenly on the spur of the moment deciding that I better get you home right away. It was a struggle getting you to the truck, but I'm a big woman, as you may have noticed, and I had a pile of blankets in the back. I got you in and wrapped you up, and even then, with the light fading and all, I thought you looked familiar. I thought maybe he would get the old Camaro out of the parking garage and just drive west instead of getting on the plane. What the hell was there in New York anyway? The townhouse, empty, bleak, unwelcoming, possibly burgled. Screw it, he thought, drinking more champagne. Go west, young man, go west. The idea had been crazy enough to make sense. Take nothing but a change of clothes and his bag I found. I put that in too, but there wasn't anything else I could see, and I was scared you might die on me or something, so I fired up old Bessie and I got your Manuscript of fast cars and hit the road to Vegas or Reno or maybe even the City of Angels. He remembered the idea had also seemed a bit silly at first. A trip the kid of 24 he had been when he had sold his first novel might have taken, but not one for a man 2 years past his 40th birthday. A few more glasses of champagne and the idea no longer seemed silly at all. It seemed, in fact, almost noble. Kind of grand odyssey to somewhere, a way to reacquaint himself with the reality after the fictional terrain of the novel. So he had gone out like a light. I was sure you were going to die. I was sure you were going to die. I was sure. So I slipped your wallet out of your back pocket and I looked at your driver's license and I saw the name Paul Sheldon and I thought, oh, that must be a coincidence. But the picture on the license also looked like you. And then I got so scared I had to sit down at the kitchen table. I thought at first that I was going to faint. After a while, I started thinking maybe the picture was just a coincidence too. Those driver's license photos don't look like anybody. But then I found your Writers Guild card and one from Penn, P-E-N, all caps, I don't know what this stands for. And I knew you were in trouble when the snow started coming down, but long before that, he had stopped in the Boulder Auto Bar and tipped George $20 to provide him with a second bottle of Dom, and he had drunk it rolling up I-70 into the Rockies under a sky the color of gunmetal, and somewhere east of the Eisenhower Tunnel, he had diverted from the turnpike because the roads were bare and dry. The storm was sliding off to the south where the hay and also the damn tunnel made him nervous. He had been playing an old Bo Diddley tape on the cassette machine under the dash and never turned on the radio until the Camaro started to seriously slip and slide, and he began to realize that this wasn't just a passing up country flurry, but the real thing. The storm was maybe not sliding off to the south after all. The storm was maybe coming right at him, and he was maybe in a bucket of trouble, the way you are in trouble now. But he had been just drunk enough to think he could drive his way out of it, so instead of stopping in Kana and inquiring about shelter, he had driven on. He could remember the afternoon turning into a dull gray chromium lens. He could remember the champagne beginning to wear off. He could remember leaning forward to get his cigarettes off the dashboard. And that was when the last skid began, and he tried to write it out, but it kept getting worse. He could remember a heavy, dull thump, and then the worlds up and down had swapped places. He had screamed, and when I heard you screaming, I knew that you would live. Dying men rarely scream. They haven't the energy. I know. I decided I would make you live, so I got some of my pain medication and made you take it. Then you went to sleep. When you woke up and started to scream again, I gave you some more. You ran a fever for a while, but I knocked that out too. I gave you Keflex. You had 1 or 2 close calls, but that's all over now, I promise. She got up. And now it's time you rested, Paul. You gotta get your strength back. My legs hurt. Yes, I'm sure they do. In an hour you can have some medication. Now, please. It shamed him to beg, but he could not help it. The tide had gone out, and the splintered pilings stood bare, jaggedly real things, which could neither be avoided nor dealt with. In an hour. Firmly. She moved toward the door with the spoon and the soup bowl in one hand. Wait! She turned back, looking at him with an expression both stern and loving. He did not like the expression, didn't like it at all. 2 weeks since you pulled me out? She looked vague again, and annoyed. He had come to know that her grasp of time was not good. Something like that. I was unconscious almost all the time. What did I eat? She considered him. IV, she said briefly. IV, he said, and she mistook his stunned surprise for ignorance. I fed you intravenously, she said, through tubes. That's what those marks on your arms are. She looked at him with eyes that were suddenly flat and considering. You owe me your life, Paul. I hope you'll remember that. I hope you'll keep that in mind. Then she left. 7. The hour passed. Somehow and finally the hour passed. He lay in bed, sweating and shivering at the same time. From the other room came first the sounds of Hawkeye and Hot Lips, and then the disc jockeys on WKRP, that wild and crazy Cincinnati radio station. An announcer's voice came on, extolled Ginsu knives, gave an 800 number, and informed those Colorado watchers who had simply been panting for a good set of Ginsu knives that operators were standing by. Paul Sheldon was also standing by. She reappeared promptly when the clock in the other room struck 8 with 2 capsules and a glass of water. He hoisted himself eagerly on his elbows as she sat on the bed. "I finally got your new book 2 days ago," she told him. Ice tinkled in the glass. It was a maddening sound. "Misery's Child, I love it. It's as good as all the rest. Better. The best." "Thank you," he managed. He could feel the sweat standing out on his forehead. "Please, my legs. Very painful." "I knew she would marry Ian," she said, smiling dreamily, "and I believe Jeffrey and Ian will become friends again, eventually." "Do they?" But immediately she said, "No, don't tell. I want to find out for myself. I'm making it last. It always seems so long before there is another one." The pain throbbed in his legs and made a deep steel circlet around his crotch. He had touched himself down there and he thought his pelvis was intact, but it felt twisted and weird. Below his knees it felt as if nothing was intact. He didn't want to look. He could see the twisted, lumpy shapes outlined in the bedclothes, and that was enough. "Please, Miss Wilkes, the pain. Call me Annie. All my friends do." She gave him the glass. It was cool and beaded with moisture. She kept the capsules. The capsules in her hand were the tide. She was the moon, and she had brought the tide which would cover the pilings. She brought them toward his mouth, which he immediately dropped open, and then she withdrew them. "I took the liberty of looking in your little bag. You don't mind, do you?" No, of course not. The medicine, the beads of sweat on his forehead felt alternately hot and cold. Was he going to scream? He thought perhaps he was. "I see there is a manuscript in there," she said. She held the capsules in her right hand, which she now slowly tilted. They fell into her left hand. His eyes followed them. "It's called Fast Cars. Not a misery novel, I know that." She looked at him with faint disapproval, but as before it was mixed with love. It was a maternal look. No cars in the 19th century, fast or otherwise. She tittered at this small joke. "I also took the liberty of glancing through it. You don't mind, do you?" "Please," he moaned. "No, but please." Her left hand tilted. The capsules rolled, hesitated, and then fell back into her right hand with a minute clicking sound. "And if I read it? You wouldn't mind if I read it?" No. His bones were shattered, his legs filled with festering shards of broken glass. No. He made something he hoped was a smile. "No, of course not." "Because I would never presume to do such a thing without your permission," she said earnestly. "I respect you too much. In fact, Paul, I love you." She crimsoned suddenly and alarmingly. One of the capsules dropped from her hand to the coverlet. Paul snatched at it, but she was quicker. He moaned, but she did not notice. After grabbing the capsule, she went vague again, looking toward the window. "Your mind," she said, "your creativity. That is all I meant." In desperation, because it was the only thing he could think of, he said, "I know, you're my #1 fan." She did not just warm up this time, she lit up. "That's it," she cried, "that's it, exactly. And you wouldn't mind if I read it in that spirit, would you? The spirit of fan love?" "Even though I don't like your other books as well as the misery stories?" "No," he said and closed his eyes. "No, turn the pages of the manuscript into paper hats if you want. Just, please, I'm dying in here." "You're good," she said gently. "I knew you would be. Just reading your books, I knew you would be. A man who could think of Misery Chastain, first think of her and then breathe life into her, could be nothing else." Her fingers were in his mouth suddenly, shockingly intimate, dirtily welcome. He sucked the capsules from between them and swallowed even before he could fumble the spilling glass of water to his mouth. "Just like a baby," she said. But he couldn't see her because his eyes were still closed, and now he felt the sting of tears. But good. There is so much I want to ask you, so much I want to know. The springs creaked as she got up. We are going to be very happy here, she said. And although a bolt of horror ripped into his heart, Paul still did not open his eyes. 8. He drifted. The tide came in and he drifted. The TV played in the other room for a while, and then didn't. Sometimes the clock chimed and he tried to count the chimes, but he kept getting lost between. IV through tubes, that's what those marks on your arms are. He got up on one elbow and pawed for the lamp and finally got it turned on. He looked at his arms, and in the folds of his elbows he saw fading, overlapped shades of purple and ochre, a hole filled with black blood at the center of each bruise. He lay back, looking at the ceiling, listening to the wind. He was near the top of the Great Divide in the heart of winter. He was with the woman who was not right in her head, a woman who had fed him with IV drips when he was unconscious, a woman who had an apparently never-ending supply of dope, a woman who had told no one he was here. These things were important, but he began to realize that something else was more important. The tide was going out again. He began to wait for the sound of her alarm clock upstairs. It would not go off for some long while yet, but it was time for him to start waiting for it to be time. She was crazy, but he needed her. Oh, I am in so much trouble, he thought, and stared blindly up at the ceiling as the droplets of sweat began to gather on his forehead again. 9. The next morning she brought him more soup and told him she had read 40 pages of what she called his manuscript book. She told him she didn't think it was as good as his others. It's hard to follow, it keeps jumping back and forth in time. Technique, he said. He was somewhere between hurting and not hurting, and so was able to think a little better about what she was saying. Technique, that's all it is. The subject dictates the form. In some vague way, he supposed that such tricks of the trade might interest, even fascinate her. Goodness knew they had fascinated the attendees of the writers' workshops, to whom he had sometimes lectured when he was younger. The boy's mind, you see, is confused, and so... Yes, he's very confused, and that makes him less interesting. Not uninteresting. I'm sure you couldn't create an uninteresting character, but less interesting. And the profanity, every other word is that F word. It has... She ruminated, feeding him the soup automatically, wiping his mouth when he dribbled almost without looking, the way an experienced typist rarely looks at the keys, so he came to understand effortlessly that she had been a nurse, not a doctor, oh no. Doctors would not know when the dribbles would come or be able to forecast the course of each with such a nice exactitude. If the forecaster in charge of that storm had been half as good at his job as Annie Wilkes is at hers, I would not be in this fucking jam, he thought bitterly. It has no nobility, she cried suddenly, jumping and almost spilling beef barley soup on his white upturned face. Yes, he said patiently, I understand what you mean, Annie. It's true that Tony Bonasaro has no nobility. He's a slum kid trying to get out of a bad environment, you see, and those words, everybody uses those words, and they do not, she said, giving him a forbidding look. What do you think I do when I go to the feed store in town? What do you think I say? Now, Tony, give me a bag of that effing pig feed and a bag of that bitchly cow corn and some of that Christing ear mite medicine. And what do you think he says to me? You're effing right, Annie, coming right the F up. She looked at him, her face now like a sky which might spawn tornadoes at any instant. He lay back, frightened. The soup bowl was tilting in her hands. 1, then 2 drops fell on the coverlet. And then do I go down the street to the bank and say to Mrs. Bollinger, here's one big bastard of a check, and you better give me $50 effing just as effing quick as you can? Do you think that when they put me up there on the stand and a stream of muddy-colored beef soup fell on the coverlet? She looked at it, then at him, and her face twisted. There! Look what you made me do! I'm sorry. "Sure you are!" she screamed and threw the bowl into the corner where it shattered. Soup splashed up the wall. He gasped. She turned off then. She just sat there for what might have been 30 seconds. During that time, Paul Sheldon's heart did not seem to beat at all. She roused a little at a time, and suddenly she tittered. "I have such a temper," she said. "I'm sorry," he said out of a dry throat. "You should be." Her face went slack again. She looked moodily at the wall. He thought she was going to blink out again, but instead she fetched a sigh and lifted her bulk from the bed. "You don't have any need to use such words in the misery books, because they didn't use such words at all back then. They weren't even invented. Animal times demand animal words, I suppose, but that was a better time. You ought to stick to your misery novels, Paul. I say that sincerely, as your #1 fan." She went to the door and looked back at him. "I'll put that manuscript book back in your bag and finish Misery's Child. I may go back to the other one later, when I'm done." "Don't do that if it makes you mad," he said. He tried to smile. "I'd rather not have you mad. I sort of depend on you, you know." She did not return his smile. "Yes," she said, "you do. You do, don't you, Paul?" She left. 10. The tide went out. The pilings were back. He began to wait for the clock to chime. 2 chimes. The chimes came. He lay propped up on the pillows, watching the door. She came in. She was wearing an apron over her cardigan and one of her skirts. In one hand she held a floor bucket. "I suppose you want your cock-a-doodle medication," she said. "Yes, please." He tried to smile at her ingratiatingly and felt that shame again. He felt grotesque to himself, a stranger. "I have it," she said, "but first I have to clean up the mess in the corner, the mess you made. You'll have to wait until I do that." He lay in the bed with his legs making shapes like broken branches under the coverlet and cold sweat running down his face in little slow creaks. He lay and watched as she crossed to the corner and set the bucket down, and then picked up the pieces of the bowl and took them out and came back and knelt by the bucket and fished in it and brought out a soapy rag and wrung it out and began to wash the dried soup from the wall. He lay and watched, and at last he began to shiver, and the shivering made the pain worse, but he could not help it. Once she turned around and saw him shivering and soaking the bedclothes in sweat, and she favored him with such a sly, knowing smile that he could easily have killed her. "It's dried on," she said, turning her face back into the corner. "I'm afraid this is going to take a while, Paul." She scrubbed. The stains slowly disappeared from the plaster, but she went on dipping the cloth, wringing it out, scrubbing, and then repeating the whole process. He could not see her face, but the idea, the certainty that she had gone blank and might go on scrubbing the wall for hours, tormented him. At last, just before the clock chimed once, marking 2:30, she got up and dropped the rag into the water. She took the bucket from the room without a word. He lay in bed, listening to the creaking boards which marked her heavy, stolid passage, listening as she poured the water out of her bucket, and incredibly, the sound of the faucet as she drew more. He began to cry soundlessly. The tide had never gone out so far. He could see nothing but drying mud flats and those splintered pilings which cast their eternal damaged shadows. She came back and stood for just a moment inside the doorway, observing his wet face with that same mixture of sternness and maternal love. Then her eyes drifted to the corner where no sign of the splash soup remained. "Now I must rinse," she said, "or else this soap will leave a dull spot. I must do it all. I must make everything right. Living alone as I do is no excuse whatever for scamping the job. My mother had a motto, Paul, and I live by it. Once nasty, never neat, she used to say." "Please," he groaned, "please, the pain. I'm dying." "No, you're not dying." "I'll scream," he said, beginning to cry harder. It hurt to cry. It hurt his legs and it hurt his heart. "I won't be able to help it." "Then scream," she said, "but remember that you made that mess, not me. It's nobody's fault but your own." Somehow he was able to keep from screaming. He watched as she dipped and wrung and rinsed, dipped and wrung and rinsed. At last, just as the clock in what he assumed was the parlor began to strike 3, she rose and picked up the bucket. She's going to go out now. She's going to go out, and I'll hear her pouring the rinse water down the sink, Maybe she won't come back for hours because maybe she's not done punishing me yet. But instead of leaving, she walked over to the bed and fished in her apron pocket. She brought out not 2 capsules, but 3. Here, she said tenderly. He gobbled them into his mouth, and when he looked up, he saw her lifting the yellow plastic floor bucket toward him. It filled his field of vision like a falling moon. Grayish water slopped over the rim onto the coverlet. "Wash them down with this?" she said. Her voice was still tender. He stared at her, and her face was all eyes. "Do it," she said. "I know you can dry swallow them, but please believe me when I say I can make them come right back up again. After all, it's only rinse water. It won't hurt you." She leaned over him like a monolith, the bucket slightly tipped. He could see the rag twisting slowly in its dark depths like a drowned thing. He could see a thin scrum of soap on top. Part of him groaned, but none of him hesitated. He drank quickly, washing the pills down, and the taste in his mouth was as it had been on the occasions when his mother made him brush his teeth with soap. His belly hitched, and he made a thick sound. "I wouldn't throw them up, Paul. No more until 9 tonight." She looked at him for a moment with a flat, empty gaze, and then her face lit up and she smiled. "You won't make me mad again, will you?" "No," he whispered. "Anger the moon which brought the tide. What an idea. What a bad idea." "I love you," she said, and kissed him on the cheek. She left, not looking back, carrying the floor bucket the way a sturdy countrywoman might carry a milk pail, slightly away from her body with no thought at all, so that none would spill. He lay back, tasting grit and plaster in his mouth and throat, tasting soap. "I won't throw up, won't throw up, won't throw up." At last, the urgency of this thought began to fade, and he realized he was going to sleep. He had held everything down long enough for the medication to begin its work. He had won, this time.